Two cities, one night. The sirens in Jerusalem activated too late to give civilians the full warning window they were promised. The impacts in Tel Aviv were already being counted before the Jerusalem intercept batteries had completed their first engagement sequence, not one after the other, not sequentially, with hours between them and separate defensive responses, at the exact same time. While whatever remained over Tel Aviv was being directed at one incoming salvo, a separate salvo was already in terminal phase over Jerusalem. And Iran fired both, knowing that the sum of what remained over both cities combined, after 5 Tel Aviv strikes, after 1 Jerusalem strike, after 4 weeks of the most sustained ballistic missile campaign against a defended city in the history of modern warfare, was not enough to stop a coordinated dual-city salvo specifically designed to exceed the total defensive capacity of the entire country simultaneously. That is not escalation in the sense that the word has been used throughout this conflict to describe each successive Iranian strike. Escalation implies a reactive step upward in response to something the other side did. What happened this morning is something different. It is the planned endpoint of a campaign that was designed from the beginning to reach exactly this night, in exactly this sequence, producing exactly these conditions. And understanding why requires walking back through every phase of what Iran has been doing since February 28th, with a clarity that the events of this morning make impossible to avoid. The dual strike on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem did not happen in isolation. It was the terminal phase of a 4-stage campaign whose logic has been visible since the first missile was fired for anyone willing to read the operational sequence rather than each individual event in isolation. Phase 1 was radar destruction. In the first 3 days of the conflict, Iran systematically struck the over-the-horizon radar infrastructure that forms the nervous system of the entire Israeli and American air defense architecture across the region. These were not simply sensors. They were the earliest warning layer, detecting launches at the point of ignition, computing trajectory data across the full flight path, and giving Israeli interceptor batteries the maximum possible preparation time to generate accurate fire control solutions. When those radars went down, the defensive system did not stop working, but it began working with shorter warning timelines, degraded trajectory data, and fractured coordination between the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow layers that are designed to function as an integrated system rather than 3 independent batteries. Phase 2 was attrition. Wave after wave, night after night, Iran fired enough to force Israel to fire interceptors without firing enough in any single wave to produce a dramatic single-night breakthrough that would have generated the kind of international and domestic pressure that might have forced an early political resolution. Each wave consumed interceptors. Each wave moved the consumption curve further ahead of the production and redistribution curve. Each wave shortened the distance between the current stockpile level and the depletion threshold that would produce the first uncontested strike. Iran produces approximately 100 missiles per month. The United States manufactures only 6 to 7 interceptors in the same period, at a cost ratio of $3 to $6 million per intercept against $200,000 to $800,000 per Iranian missile. The mathematics of that exchange were never sustainable for the defending side. Iran understood that arithmetic before the first missile was fired. Phase 3 was exploitation. Once the Tel Aviv depletion threshold was crossed on the night the magazines ran dry, Iran did not pause to let the stockpile recover. It continued striking at a pace that kept the consumption rate above the production and redistribution rate. The Fateh 3 and Khaybar Shekan rounds introduced weapon types that the residual upper-tier interceptors could not reliably defeat even when they were present. The first Jerusalem strike demonstrated that the geographic scope of Iran's uncontested reach had expanded beyond Tel Aviv, and the strikes on Dimona and Arad, the first time Iranian missiles penetrated Israel's air defense systems in the vicinity of the nuclear facility, confirmed that even the most heavily protected southern corridor had been breached. Netanyahu's security cabinet decision to concentrate remaining interceptors over the Tel Aviv to Jerusalem corridor was the rational military triage response to the attrition that phases 1 through 3 had produced. It was also the observable signal that Iran's targeting apparatus had been waiting for. Phase 4 is what happened this morning. Having observed the concentration decision through its surveillance apparatus, having assessed the total interceptor capacity now positioned over both cities, having calculated that the sum of both concentrated defensive envelopes was insufficient to stop a salvo large enough and diverse enough to exceed their combined capacity, Iran fired at both simultaneously. The dual strike was not an improvisation. It was the planned endpoint of the entire campaign. The operational picture of this morning's dual strike tells you something important about the level of planning and intelligence behind it, because the Tel Aviv salvo and the Jerusalem salvo were not identical packages fired simultaneously. They were specifically tailored to the different defensive conditions over each city. The Tel Aviv package was built around volume, speed, and the engagement sequencing paralysis that Iran has been refining across 5 previous strikes on the city. Tel Aviv's defensive coverage, even after the concentration of redistributed interceptors was weighted toward the Fateh series maneuvering re-entry vehicles that had proven effective in previous engagements. The Tel Aviv package in this morning's dual strike included Khorramshahr and K-Bar Shikan rounds as primary penetration vehicles, supplemented by Shahed 238 jets timed to arrive simultaneously to force the engagement sequencing paralysis that forces a battery to choose between two simultaneous threats. The targeting within Tel Aviv was directed at infrastructure aim points in the central and northern districts, areas of high population density and high commercial and government infrastructure concentration. The Jerusalem package was built differently. Jerusalem's defensive coverage after the concentration decision was weighted toward Aero assets prioritized for the city because of its symbolic and strategic significance. Aero is most effective against standard ballistic trajectories at high altitude. The Jerusalem package included Qadr series medium-range ballistic missiles with modified terminal guidance, targeting the approach vectors where Aero's effectiveness is most constrained by the terrain and urban interference of Jerusalem's geography. The result was a dual strike, where each city's specific defensive profile was exploited by a package calibrated for exactly that profile. Not by a generic salvo, but by one designed to defeat the specific remaining defensive architecture of each city simultaneously. Iran hit 23 targets inside Tel Aviv in a single night in the preceding weeks. This morning it hit 2 cities at the same time. The progression from single city targeting to dual city targeting was not a sudden leap. It was the next logical step in a campaign that has been systematically expanding the scope of what Iran can reach without meaningful interception. The shelter guidance that the Israeli government has been issuing to its civilian population throughout this conflict, go to the shelter when the sirens sound, has now been tested against 5 strikes on Tel Aviv and 2 strikes on Jerusalem. In every case, the strikes have reached the city. In every case, the shelter instruction has been issued against a defensive background that the government knew was materially insufficient to provide the coverage the instruction implies. And in every case, the government has maintained the shelter instruction without updating the Israeli public on the gap between what the instruction promises and what the current defensive system can deliver. The warning timeline that the shelter instruction depends on is the 9-second to 90-second window that the civil defense model was built around, the time between the siren and the impact within which a person can reach a shelter and close the door. That timeline is derived from a functioning early warning radar architecture that adds the detection to warning conversion time to the intercept calculation. The radar architecture that provided that warning timeline was systematically destroyed in the first 3 days of this conflict. The warning timeline that Israeli civilians have been operating under since then is materially shorter than the civil defense model was built to address. 2 elderly civilians, a couple in their 70s, were killed near Tel Aviv during an earlier strike because they could not reach their safe room in time after the sirens activated too late. The government knows the warning timeline has shrunk. It has not told its civilian population that the instruction it is giving them was designed for a defensive environment that no longer exists. After a dual strike on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem simultaneously, that gap is no longer something that communication strategy or careful official language can manage. The Israeli public can count 5 strikes on Tel Aviv, 2 strikes on Jerusalem, both cities hit on the same night. The question every Israeli civilian is asking tonight is not what happened. That question answers itself from the news and from the sky. The question is why they were told something different about their safety than what the defensive reality warranted. And that question does not have an answer that sustains public confidence in the government that gave those assurances. For Netanyahu, the dual strike represents the final collapse of the official narrative that has sustained his war cabinet's domestic position throughout this conflict. The narrative was structured around 2 pillars. The military campaign against Iran was achieving its objectives, and the defensive architecture was protecting Israeli civilians from the full weight of Iranian retaliation. 5 strikes on Tel Aviv and 2 strikes on Jerusalem, delivered simultaneously on the same night, is a data set that cannot be made to support either pillar by any combination of official framing, selective disclosure, or crisis communication strategy. The narrative is gone. What remains is a prime minister who launched a war described on day 4 as a quick and decisive operation, who is now in his 4th week of that war, who has watched Iranian missiles strike his 2 most important cities in a single night, who cannot protect either city from the next strike, and who is managing all of that while his corruption trial continues. His pardon request remains rejected, and his poll numbers have deteriorated to their worst level of this conflict. The coalition that supported entering this conflict was built on the promise of a short campaign with achievable objectives and a defensive shield that could absorb retaliatory fire without catastrophic civilian impact. The dual strike has voided every premise of that coalition's original support calculation. The political path through this morning is not visible from any angle that does not require either a fundamental change in military strategy, one that would require conceding that the current approach has not produced the results it was sold on, or a ceasefire negotiated from the position of an adversary that has just demonstrated it can hit Tel Aviv and Jerusalem simultaneously without being stopped. Neither option is one that Netanyahu's political survival is designed to absorb, and both options are now the only two on the table. For Washington, the dual strike is the event that forces the question the administration has been managing around since the first uncontested Tel Aviv strike. What is the United States willing to do differently to change the military situation on the ground? The bounded retaliatory strikes against Iranian launch infrastructure that followed the carrier group attack and the early base strikes have not changed Iran's operational picture in any meaningful way. Bloomberg reported that half of Iran's missile launchers remained intact after 2 weeks of the most expensive American air campaign since the Iraq invasion. CENTCOM reported an 86% reduction in Iranian ballistic missile launches as an early metric, but that assessment has not survived the operational reality of Iran's 66th coordinated strike wave, which simultaneously targeted Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and 5 U.S. military bases across Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE using Qadr, Khorramshahr, and Khaybar Shekan ballistic missiles. A dual strike on 2 Israeli cities this morning is not the result of a campaign that has degraded Iran's launch capability to a level that changes the operational picture. It is the result of a campaign that has consumed over $11 billion without changing the operational picture, and now has to account for where that $11 billion went against what it was supposed to achieve. 5 KC-135 refueling aircraft destroyed in Saudi Arabia. The Truman Carrier Group forced to withdraw from its original position. The 5th Fleet facility at Bahrain damaged. Every American ally Washington asked for direct support refused publicly and on the record. The administration that told the American public this campaign was ahead of schedule faces the specific political problem that the schedule it described does not produce a dual strike on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in its 4th week. And the domestic political sustainability of an $11 billion commitment that has produced that outcome, not a ceasefire, not a regime change, not a destroyed nuclear program, but 2 allied cities struck simultaneously while interceptors run dry, is a question that the dual strike has made impossible to defer in a press briefing. For Iran, the dual strike represents the successful execution of the campaign it designed before the first missile was fired. The stated objectives of the United States and Israel on February 28th were regime change, destruction of Iran's ballistic missile capability, and elimination of Iran's nuclear program. The operational scorecard 4 weeks in is worth reading in full. Iran's government is intact under a new supreme leader following the killing that triggered the conflict. Iran's ballistic missile capability just demonstrated it can strike 2 of Israel's most important cities simultaneously without meaningful defensive response. Iran's nuclear infrastructure has not been reached by any strike that has been confirmed as achieving its destruction objective. The strikes on nuclear sites have produced contested damage assessments, with Iran claiming continued functionality of key enrichment infrastructure. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Oil is above $100 a barrel. 5 KC-135 refueling aircraft have been destroyed. The Truman Carrier Group has been moved. American allies have refused to participate. And this morning, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem were struck simultaneously on a night when neither city had enough interceptors left to stop what came in. The gap between what the campaign was supposed to achieve and what it has actually produced is the widest it has been since the first bomb dropped on February 28th. And the dual strike is the most visible single demonstration of that gap this conflict has yet produced. It is also the clearest possible signal that Iran's operational planning has run ahead of every adjustment the American and Israeli response has been able to make. That is not a comfortable position for 2 of the most sophisticated military establishments in the world to be in at the end of week 4 of a conflict they initiated. And it is a position that gets harder to explain with each night that produces a new data point like the one this morning generated. The open question hanging over every capital watching this conflict, in Washington, in Jerusalem, in Tehran, in every allied capital that declined to help and is now watching the consequences, is not what happened this morning. That question answers itself. The question is what stopping looks like. Not winning. Stopping. Because winning, as it was defined on February 28th, regime change, destroyed ballistic missile capability, eliminated nuclear program, is no longer available to either side on the timeline that the political and economic pressures of this conflict allow. The Knesset will not sustain indefinite missile strikes on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem simultaneously, while the official narrative that the defensive architecture is protecting civilians has been conclusively disproven by the sky above both cities last night. The U.S. Congress will not sustain an $11 billion commitment that has produced a dual strike on 2 allied cities while half of the adversary's launchers remain intact. And the Israeli public, which has now absorbed 5 strikes on Tel Aviv and 2 strikes on Jerusalem in the same night, is asking the question that Netanyahu's communication apparatus was designed to prevent from being asked: was this worth it on the terms it was sold? The ceasefire conversation that has been happening quietly in the diplomatic channels since the first uncontested Tel Aviv strike is now happening loudly. Iran will negotiate from the position of an adversary that has just hit Tel Aviv and Jerusalem simultaneously without being stopped. Israel will negotiate from the position of a government that started a war it cannot end on its original terms. And Washington will negotiate from the position of a superpower that spent $11 billion to find out that the operational assumptions its campaign was built on were wrong. What each of those three parties is willing to accept as the condition for stopping is the question being worked right now. And the answer, whatever it turns out to be, will be shaped by the specific fact that this morning Iran fired at two cities at once.